Thank you, John. Now David with his 8-minute second rebuttal.
Thank you, John. But know that this is going to hurt you more than it hurts me. John says that nothing is historically certain. Well, it's pretty. I already said we're not talking about mathematical certainty here, but there is historical certainty where there is just no reasonable reason to believe anything other than what is the case. And again, the facts that I laid down. What refutation have we seen of any of these facts? Right? We're about to be going to the crossfire and conclusions. What evidence have we seen that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that his disciples weren't convinced that he appeared to them, that Paul and James, who didn't believe in Jesus at first but came to believe in him after they claimed that they received appearances, or the original apostles? What evidence have we had that none of this happened? And the answer is none. We've just got, well, you can't base your beliefs on 4th century texts. When again, every respected scholar on the planet understands how textual criticism works, that you can get. There are no variants that would affect any of these beliefs. So you take any manuscript you want. There's nothing that would affect anything I've said so far. And even if you wanted to throw all of that out, we know what the next generation of Christian leaders proclaim, people who knew the apostles. We are not in a state of just, we don't know anything that could ever happen or anything that happened. It's just a position where if you want to go that far, we just can't know anything. John says, again, the Gospels don't contain eyewitness testimony. I would invite him to read Richard Bauckham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, where he goes through the Gospels and shows that they are filled with eyewitness testimony, even if you don't want to grant an authorship by the apostle. He says that the story of the guard at the tomb is ludicrous. By the way, did I base anything on the story of the guard at the tomb? Did I base one point on the story of the guard at the tomb? If you get rid of the Gospel of Matthew, nothing I say is effective, right? If you get rid of the Gospel of Luke, nothing I say has been effective. I went to material that is much earlier than the Gospels, right? And I went there because it's actual scholars, atheist, agnostic scholars saying, yes, Christians, if you want to go with some material, go with this. It's the earliest. It's indisputable. But with the story, even with the story, John, it's obviously absurd. But look at what Matthew says about the story. He says, and this is when he explains that the guards were paid. He said that this is the story that is circulated among Jews till this day. It was a common story, right? People had heard the story. He's responding to an objection by the Jews. Well, if the Jews are the ones telling the story, why does John think that Matthew is making it up and that everyone else rejects it? John says that Paul refers to 500 rather than 499 or 501. This calls into question the credibility. Paul says more than 500, right? In other words, he doesn't have an exact number. It's more than 500 though, right? It's like the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. How would we know? Well, Jesus actually had them sit in groups of 50 and 100. So you'd have, 50, 50, 50. You could count, right? Without getting an exact number. I don't see how that would call into question. If it said 503, I would say that might call into question the reliability. Saying it was more than 500, I don't see a problem here. John says that if God exists, he sure would have wanted to keep John in the fold by giving him, some sort of miracles or something like that. Because of all the damage John is going to do, and God would really. But suppose God allowed this to happen to give me this opportunity to show how flimsy people's reasons are for leaving Christianity. John says he wants to believe by becoming as skeptical as possible. By becoming more skeptical than any respected scholar on the planet, by becoming so unimaginably skeptical that we have to reject all of history. That's someone who wants to believe. Now, John argues that Paul's experience was visionary, and he even says that Paul in Galatians 1 denies that he received any historical tradition from the apostles. That's absolute nonsense. If you look at Galatians 1, when Paul says that his gospel is not from man and he didn't receive it from man, read what he says in chapter 2. He's saying he got the gospel to the Gentiles, whereas the other apostles got the gospels to the Jews, right? So he gets some sort of revelation along the line of a gospel that he gets to preach to Gentiles, telling them they don't need to be circumcised, they don't need to follow kosher dietary laws and so on, and that he's got, and this is the message. This is what he's talking about in the gospel there, not whether Jesus died on the cross or rose from the dead. That's not in dispute. So what do we have? We have, he says that Paul is visionary. Well, notice, even in the instances that we have that talk about Paul's experience, as John already mentioned, Paul says that he saw Jesus, and the accounts that we have in the Gospel of Acts, there were certainly objective features of this appearance. So if you want to say vision, that's fine, but acknowledge this isn't just a mentally subjective appearance, right? It's something out there because other people are seeing light, hearing noise as well. But here's the kicker. Paul believed in a physical resurrection of the dead. I don't think John rejects this. Paul believed in a physical resurrection. If Paul believes in a physical resurrection, something has to happen, right? Something has to happen to Paul because Jews did not believe in a physical resurrection until the judgment. So if Paul had just seen a vision that has no objective content outside of him mentally seeing something, if Paul sees some sort of appearance like that, he would never conclude physical bodily resurrection. He would say, Jesus appeared to me in a vision. They had no problem with visions. They loved visions. People had visions, right? When you see a vision, has anyone in here ever had a loved one die and then you had some sort of dream or vision or something like that of the dead loved one appearing to you? Anyone? Okay, we have a couple, right? Did you conclude that the coffin was empty? Would you conclude that the coffin is now empty, that the person has been raised physically from the dead? Neither would a first century Jew. A first century Jew, if you see a vision, you've seen a vision. But they all conclude, the apostles and Paul conclude, physical bodily resurrection. What could change their minds about Jesus? Guess what? A vision can't do it. John's saying, they're visionaries. They see visions. Right. If they saw visions, they would have said, wow, God is letting us know that Jesus is okay. Jesus will be resurrected on the last day just like everyone else. They don't conclude that. They conclude physical bodily resurrection. What could change their mind about their entire belief system? What could change them so that they no longer think that the resurrection only occurs at the end, but that it started in the person of Jesus? It would have to be something radical, and it would have to be the kind of stories we find in the Gospels with Jesus actually appearing to them saying, here, watch me eat a fish. So we have basic facts. Jesus died. The disciples were convinced that he appeared to them. Not just one, not just two, but a bunch, over 500. Multiple groups of people see him. Multiple individuals see him. Friends and foes see him. They're willing to go to their bloody, horrible deaths proclaiming this. We can't say they're lying. You can't say it's hallucinations because too many of them see it. You can't say it's legend because it's too early. What explanation do we have? The only way around this is just to say, I'm not going to believe any of it. I'm not going to believe any source. I'm going to throw out all the evidence we have because it's so long ago. Well, if you do that, then yes, you would reject the resurrection. If you actually believe that we can know something about history, then we have these facts that are granted by scholars across the spectrum, and we can know that these facts only fit one conclusion, and that's that Jesus rose from the dead. So if you reject the resurrection, it's not based on the evidence. It's based on something else.
Thank you, David. And now John's second rebuttal.
Can I have two rebuttals, or do I just get one? Can I have two to his one?
This will be your day.
I know. Let's see. Where to begin? We don't know that when Paul had his vision that he instantly concluded the tomb was empty. That was an evolutionary trajectory in the early church. Burial traditions and appearance narratives change from gospel to gospel. Mark simply says Jesus was buried in a rock-hewn tomb with a stone rolled against the entrance, whereas Matthew's later gospel says Jesus was buried in his own new tomb. See, it's growing. The story is growing. And the stone in Mark has now become a great stone in Matthew. Luke adds that it was a tomb where no one had yet been laid. Another addition. And the chief priests, we're told in Matthew, bribed the soldiers to spread a lie around about it in order to solidify the fact that the tomb was actually, there's evidence that the tomb was empty, and the guards are proof of that evidence, and the stories that continue to grow. The appearance narratives from none in Mark to clasping Jesus' feet in Matthew, to Luke's Jesus showing his hands and feet. Oh, that's much more evidence. Now we've got him showing hands and feet with nail prints, not just clasping at his feet and not just showing him, but look at my hands, he says, and my feet, as I myself touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have. The stories are growing incrementally because they're being questioned. And so we got to expand on this story. The disciples are even give him a fish to eat in Luke. Not only that, but Jesus speaks about prophecy, which proves what they have just seen and heard. But there's no prophecy, and I can't trust anybody who misinterprets prophecy. I don't care if it's the book of Acts. I don't care if it's Paul. You look at the original prophecies in the Old Testament, and you try to make sense of them as prophecies of Jesus, and you cannot do it. There's not one single sentence in the Old Testament that points to Jesus as a Messiah, as a resurrected, born, incarnate God from a virgin that can be interpreted as fulfilled in Jesus. I don't care what the New Testament writers say. They're wrong when they use it that way. And the reason why they went back and started searching for prophecies of Jesus is because the Jews, rational people that they were, they questioned it, the story. And so then the Christians, they went back in the Old Testament. They had to prove that no, there's prophecy too. Just like the tomb was a great stone, and he was laid in a really nice new tomb, and people got to feel his hands. We got to produce stories that have more evidence, and so we've got to have prophecy too. And they went back in the Old Testament. They found anything they could. But the prophecies aren't there. I know you've been taught all your life otherwise. And if you want to check into that, I've got a chapter in one of my books that I think would enlighten you, if you're interested. And so in the Gospel of John, you have a different story. Now you got doubting Thomas. Oh, I won't believe until I see. The thing is, that's not evidence. It's a story. To us, it's a story. It's a 4th century manuscript of a story. That itself is not evidence. That is in the text. And so doubting Thomas says, I want to see put my hands into your side and stuff like that. And he does it, and it bleeds. And it says, well, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. How many cult groups have you seen say the same thing? Besides, for Jesus to walk around and to talk, he had to have blood running through his veins, because that's what the lungs are used because they've got blood flowing through them. And so for him to breathe, like it says he breathed on them, or to eat fish, or to any of those bodily functions, he had to have blood. But, he lost his blood on the cross. There's a lot of things that need to be explained rather than explained away. Okay, now David mentioned Craig Keener's book, Miracles. It's a 2-volume work, and I've read enough about it. I've not read enough of it to know it exists. Listen, it's one thing to write down verified miracles. Dr. so-and-so says he was, he had diagnosed with an ear infection, and he can't hear, and voila, after being touched, he can hear. There's one thing. That's one thing entirely. What Craig Keener did was, I should have put it in my new book, under the chapter, When All Else Fails, Lie. I'm not accusing Craig Keener of lying, but it's dishonest what he did. All he did is he traveled around, he listened to stories told by people. The person said this, he wrote it down. The person said that, he wrote it down. And he admits that, of course. I guess it's not that dishonest after all. But you can't believe that. You can't believe just people's stories. Otherwise, you're going to go travel India, travel Africa. I mean, hear their stories. Some of these cultures are superstitious people. And they'll credit God with a miracle at the drop of a hand. And you need to be questioning of those sorts of things, rather than just write them all down and then to use it as evidence. You can't use that as evidence. Listen to the stories themselves. I have doubts that the resurrection happened. So why would I doubt that? And I don't doubt everything either. I don't doubt your writing. I don't doubt that what you have to say is going to be really good. But I doubt it. It's just the same, because I'm a radical doubter. But, all right, here's I don't know if this is a good place to do that. Just ring the buzzer when you want me to stop, and I'll stop. Give me a few seconds, because, I've said all I want to say, and I'm just, wasting space here, I'd rather be a comedian, you know that? They can throw tomatoes at me that way, and I deserve them, I suppose. But here's what Keith Parsons did when he summed up the evidence. We have, at best, our second, third, or fourth-hand reports of those experiences of the resurrection of Jesus as recounted in the Gospel. We have, at best, second, third, and fourth-hand reports of those experiences of Jesus. There's no reason to think that the Gospel records are particularly reliable. On the contrary, he says, how much confidence can we have in documents, one, written by persons unknown? Can you imagine a court trial of people accusing somebody of something? And who is this person? I don't know. What's their relationship to the defendant? We don't know. Where they live? We don't know. What's their gender? We don't know. Oh, okay. Put that into the record as reliable testimony. Written by persons unknown about supposed eyewitnesses. That's what we don't have the eyewitnesses. We have writings about the supposed eyewitnesses. Oh, and Richard Bachman's book, Jesus, the evidence, eyewitness for Jesus. What's that? Jesus and the eyewitnesses. Yeah, Richard Bachman proves that the eyewitnesses were there. Oh, yeah, sure they did. Yeah, because they all share the same names. I mean, there's lots of Marys and lots of Pauls, lots of Jesuses and lots of Peters. So therefore, these people really must have existed. I mean, the real 12 disciples and Mary and Magdalene, because those were common names back then. So therefore, there must have been, real disciples named those people who actually did and said the things they did, something like that. But, the Gospels also record strange events, like an earthquake at the time of death of Jesus, and saints coming out of their graves, and other kinds of sorts of things that I would consider bizarre, but you may not. Okay. 2, composed 40 years or more after the events. 3, based on oral traditions. 4, containing many undeniably fictional elements. 5, each with clear theological bias and apologetic agendas. 6, contradicting many known facts. 7, inconsistent with each other. 8, with very little corroboration from non-Christian sources. 9, testifying to occurrences which, in any other context, would be regarded as unlikely in the stream. And he says no, and I say no.
Okay, we will switch gears, and we're going to enter a 10-minute cross-examination time, pun intended. I guess that's home court advantage, for each debater to ask the other debater. 60 seconds for the question, 60 seconds for the response, and then we'll switch. 60 seconds for a question, 60 seconds for a response. David, the first question is yours.
Oh, we agreed that it was going to be just crossfire, kind of say whatever you want rather than just ask questions.
Okay, then we will allow 1 minute for each.
Ready?
Go ahead.
All right, John, I have one request. If you want to call
Just
me,
one.
If you want to call me the worst dirtbag the world has ever seen, I
Never.
give you permission to do that fully. But please don't say anything about Craig Keener. Everyone who's ever seen this man speak knows that this is a phenomenal man of integrity. You may disagree with his method of going around for eyewitnesses, but notice what John kept complaining about. Why don't we have the eyewitnesses of the resurrection? Why don't we have the eyewitnesses? Why don't we have the eyewitnesses? Craig Keener says, all right, I'll go around the world collecting data from eyewitnesses. Everyone who is apparently involved or anywhere near it, I'll ask them all questions. I'll put the reports together. And John says, this is nothing. This is horrible. What an evil person. Very interesting methodology. If there's no eyewitness, you can dismiss it based on no eyewitness. If you have a ton of eyewitnesses, well, who cares what eyewitnesses say? They're just superstitious, biased people. And so basically, again, there's just no evidence that could ever convince you out of this level of skepticism. You have to be starting with naturalism to say, there are hundreds of millions of people who say they've witnessed miracles. I'm ruling them all out as idiots ahead of time.
So the answer to your question is, wait, was that a question?
Crossfire, say whatever you want.
Oh, I like you. Yeah, you're a good guy. No, it just seems like to me, like I said, I only touched the cover of that book and smelled it and kind of put it back on the shelf, but it's not a way for doing testimony. I mean, there are clearly superstitious people groups that, all right, let me just share you some of those stories. I got to get to this quick because I got 60 seconds, hurry up. All right, I'm not going to get it. The world of the Bible is filled with all kinds of those stories, and incredible stories of snakes that talk, where there are gods and goddesses that ruled over specific lands of the earth and met in divine councils to decide our fate. It was a world where the gods and the suns lived in the sky, and people who died went to the dark recesses of the earth, and people went to the good place where good. It was world where snake and donkey talk, where giants lived in the land, where people could live to be more than 900 years old, where a mother was turned into a pillar of salt, where a pillar of fire could lead people by night, where sun stopped moving across the sky or could even back up, where an axe head could float, or a star could point down on a specific homeland move, where people could instantly speak unwritten languages.
We'll switch.
There are people like that. There are people and cultures like that.
My time, John. My time.
And the people he interviewed.
Now, notice what John says. While the time of the Bible is filled with all these superstitious, let's say it correctly, there are people who believe that miraculous things occurred. Guess what? If you get outside of Europe and America, that's standard, right? That's standard. I mean, we're talking about converts in China. Depending on the study, between 50 and 90% of them who convert to Christianity because they believe they've seen a miracle. How do you just say they're all wrong? That they're all wrong, right? And how do you? Well, they're just superstitious. So anyone who says they've seen a miracle is automatically superstitious and is ruled out of court. What evidence could you ever ask for, right? If we all saw a miracle right now, right in front of us, and we all concluded that we'd seen a miracle, suddenly we're irrelevant because we believe in miracles and therefore we're superstitious. John, they're not dumb people, they're Asian. Normally you can't say stereotypes, but Asians like that one, so I'll let it slide.
Thank you, David. John.
I never say that ancient people were stupid, or Asians, or any other grouping of people, or gender, or sexual orientation. I don't say that at all, but I do say that there are some people who are superstitious. Not stupid, just superstitious. They just don't know any better, and a lot of us don't know any better about a lot of different things, and science came along and helped us. It's not a God, it's not a savior, but it's the best method we know for knowing the truth about the nature of things and which religion is true if there is one. But I didn't get to finish, but the handkerchiefs that could heal people, shadows that could heal people, where a pool was stirred, you jumped in it and you could get healed, where a flood could cover the whole earth, where a man could be swallowed by a great fish and live to tell about it, where a man could walk on water, calm a stormy sea, or change water into wine. It was a world populated by demons that could wreak havoc on the earth and also made people very sick. It was a world of idol worship where human and animal sacrifices pleads God. In this world we find visions, inspired dreams, prophetic utterances, miracle workers, magicians, and diviners and sorcerers, and I need a nurse right now.
I'll catch you at your breath. Thank you, John. David.
All right, John's not saying that, all the people around the world, the hundreds of millions of people around the world who claim to have witnessed miracles are stupid. They're just superstitious. But think about the situations and think about the actual cases. Child stops breathing for hours. Christian prays over the child. Child gets up. You don't need to be superstitious to think that something has happened there, right? That something supernatural has occurred. By the way, these are the kinds of stories that the 1,100-page book on miracles is filled with. You either have to say, you can't just say they're all superstitious. You have to say a lot of people are lying here, because it's not superstitious to say kid's not breathing for a couple hours, kid's alive now after Christian praise. It doesn't take superstition to come up with that. That seems like the only possible view of it, and yet, unless, of course, you're committed to rejecting any such evidence.
John?
I say what would convince me to believe. It's in a chapter in my book, Why I Became an Atheist. I don't have the time to read it right now or say it, but I do state what would convince me. Things like if the pillar of salt was detected by the Sea of Galilee, or the Red Sea, and they could detect human female DNA in it resembling Lot's wife. That kind of stuff. A pillar that was built to Abraham, saying he was our forefather, et cetera, but none of that's there. Now, I want to say this, though, about the miracles, okay? The Catholic Church has officially recognized 67 miracles. A rough estimation of the general reliability of human testimony from Lourdes, France, comes out to be 0.000167, because millions of Catholics claim to have been healed in the same way. But the reliability of human testimony for human miracles comes out to that. Now, that was investigated by the Catholic Church, believers. I would like to investigate those miracle claims myself, but I don't get a chance to do that. So human testimony about miracles is notoriously unreliable. Craig Keener's thesis is bad.
Thank you, John.
Impossible.
Well, I would invite you to read it. It's a lot of interesting statistics there, and let's just say the world is filled with a lot of people who convert to religions based on their own lies, and then really just love to spread lots of lies about them. But John, I have an interesting question. I based my entire case for the resurrection of Jesus on the earliest Christian testimony we have, not according to me, according to critical atheist agnostic scholars, and facts that are agreed upon by scholars from across the board. Notice the people I'm quoting: Bart Ehrman, people from the Jesus Seminar, people who really disagree with me a lot. And in response, John he says there's discrepancies in the Gospels, which I didn't even use as part of my case. I'd love to have a discussion about those, but it just has nothing to do with my case. And then the only sort of scholarly response is polyamorous Richard Carrier, who specializes in ancient Roman science, not in historical Jesus studies. Keith Parsons, who's a philosopher, not a historical Jesus scholar or New Testament scholar.
Thank you,
and
David.
Some anonymous guy who dates the book of Luke to 140, which I've never heard anyone do.
Thanks, David. John?
Okay, I said I think Jesus probably existed and he probably died. He was a failed apocalyptic prophet. That is, he prophesied a doomsday. Doomsday. It's going to come. It never happened. And I don't deny some of the scholarship. Bart Ehrman says, usually he says something like this. That's what they believed. Now, on the death of Jesus, he'll say, yeah, Jesus died. But on other things, he'll say, yeah, the early Christians believed he rose from the dead. That's not saying he believes Jesus raised from the dead, only that they believe that. That doesn't make me want to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Think about the ending of Mark. Okay, I'm there, I come up to the tomb, and there's two people in the white, very first recorded gospel, and two people in white say, that's what it says, that's the angels. And correct me if I'm wrong on that. A long time since I stopped memorizing scripture, and that's what I call it some days. But he is risen. Oh yeah, I'm convinced now. See?
Thank you. Thank you,
I
John.
can't.
Appreciate it. David?
I still have no idea why he's going to the Gospel of Mark at all. I'm quoting material from decades earlier, right? We're not talking about something written decades after, right? We have a creed that, according to scholars across the spectrum, is our earliest Christian material. Now John's saying, oh, but things are from the 4th century and so on. I say, fine, I'll go to the earliest material we have. And then, again, people like Ehrman and so, they're not saying, yeah, it's probably true. They're things like historically certain, those are their phrases that they're using with this material. So, just think, if I say, here's my case, fact, agreed upon across the board, resurrection's only explanation, and you say, let me attack this different thing that you didn't bring up. Well, that's not an answer, is it? So we get to the end of the debate, and there's just no response to anything I've laid out in my opening statement. And if this is scored as a debate, that all matters, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, that one, you got me on that one. I responded to a different question than you asked. But 1 Corinthians 15 recounts the stories of people who were convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. And it is the earliest one. The thing is, Paul denies, we have a dispute in Galatians, because Paul says, I deny having received this from men. And he said, chapter 2, he says, well, he did, associate with these guys. But in 1 Corinthians 13, he says, he uses very strong language in the Greek that says that, no, I did not receive these doctrines. I forget how it's worded exactly. These things, I did not receive any official teaching. That's the import of that, about these things. Just like he heard the story of the Lord's Supper by a revelation, then why can't he have heard the story of Jesus' resurrection by a revelation as well? What we're asking ourselves is two things. One, what did he see? What did they see? And it appears to me they saw visions. They were visionaries. So that doesn't mean I should believe that they saw anything at all. And two, did they all tell the same stories? I have no way of questioning them.
Thank you, John. We appreciate it. Round of applause for a difficult section there. Thank you to our two debaters. Now we'll have 5-minute closing statements from each side. David will go first.
Well, thanks again to Reston Bible Church and for John, representing the atheist position. I've presented facts, and I've shown that these facts are not disputed. It's based on material that's not disputed as being very early. John, the only thing I've detected as an actual attempt to explain the facts is John's claim that these were visionary appearances, and therefore it wasn't something that it wasn't Jesus actually appearing to them. It's some sort of vision. Let me just go ahead and quote something here. This is from Gary Sibsey, who is a psychologist at Piedmont Psychiatric Center. He writes, "I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journal articles and books written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination. That is, an event for which more than one person purportedly shared in a visual or other sensory perception where there was clearly no external referent." So group hallucinations would be extremely rare, right? Because if you're hallucinating, there's nothing out there. Other people will not see it. There are apparently phenomena where a bunch of people can be hallucinating at the same time, but these are people who are all expecting things, and not everyone sees it, right? They're independent hallucinations, in other words. Maybe they're seeing some person that they want to see. The disciples were distraught. The disciples, they were done, right? Their work was done. Their guy died. If your Messiah died, you went and got a new Messiah. That's it. They've been wasting all of these years. They're not in the state of mind. They're not in the state of mind to have these hallucinations that are fueled by expectation of seeing someone. And even if we did think that suddenly group hallucinations were incredibly popular in the first century among Jesus followers, what do you do with James? What do you do with Paul? They're certainly not expecting Jesus to appear to them. So you need one very odd theory upon another. You need theory upon theory upon theory upon theory to account for every little bit of piece of evidence we have. And is there a limit to the absurdity involved? When everything we know tells us that's not the sort of thing that happens. I mean, that's the rule that people are applying to the resurrection. Well, the resurrection's not the sort of thing that happens. Well, multiple repeated group appearances, that doesn't happen. So what's going on here? But notice there's a difference. We know that these things don't happen. You can't just say resurrections don't happen, right? You can't say that without presupposing naturalism, and that's what we simply cannot presuppose. So group hallucinations would be extremely rare, and so the only explanation we've had tonight for the actual facts that I presented just fails. And notice, you could explain anything if you wanted to say, hey, repeated group hallucinations can be used to explain what lots of people, friends and foes, as individuals and small groups and in a large group, all claim to have seen and are willing to go to their death proclaiming. You could explain this debate tonight. Did we have a debate? No. Everyone just hallucinated the same thing. You could explain anything in history that way. So if you have to resort to this sort of method, can you really say, as John did, I want to believe. I'm looking for a reason to believe. I don't think so. So tonight I've shown that Jesus died by crucifixion, that his friends and foes became convinced that he had appeared to them, that it was belief in bodily resurrection. So this can't be a vision. If it's a vision, they would conclude they had a vision. They would say, hey, I had a vision of Jesus. He's appeared to me from heaven. They would have never said resurrection. Paul, a Shammite Pharisee, would never have concluded resurrection. It went against everything he believed. Something big had to happen to shake all of these men into the belief that not only had they seen Jesus in a vision, they had seen him resurrected. He was now resurrected. What could do that? Well, resurrection can do that. Hallucination and visions just can't do that. There's just no way. So as far as what John has replied, as well, we can't know much about history. There are discrepancies in the Gospels, even though my case hasn't been based on them at all. Stories are growing incrementally, even though I pointed out you can put the Gospels in any order you want, and you can show that they're evolving stories just because some of them include more detail. And my case was based on material much earlier than the Gospels. So keep in mind, the most appearances you ever have in any story are in our earliest source. If that's evolution, it's going in reverse. So it seems like this debate comes down to what sort of explanation would you prefer? Would you prefer a supernatural explanation that fits all the facts, fits them well, and is the only explanation that actually fits the facts, but which will lead to certain theological commitments on your part? Or would you prefer a natural explanation that doesn't fit the facts, that is completely refuted by the facts and can never account for the facts? That's the difference you have here tonight.
And now John's 5-minute closing statement.
Yeah, you can. What do you do when you picture somebody having a vision? Do they picture these people naked? Do they picture these people floating through the sky? They have visions of people fully clothed, bodily visions. So it's not really beyond the scope that these visions were of a bodily Jesus initially, that grew incrementally, as I've shown in from the rock stories and from the appearance stories up until we grasped his hands and put fingers through his nails and holes in his hands and hugged him and said, we're told by Jesus, blessed is he who believes even though he doesn't see. It grows from those initial stories is what I claim. And I think the evidence is there. And the bottom line is that in my world, miracles do not happen. What world are apologists like David Wood and Mike Licona and William Lane Craig living in? The odds of a resurrection, from my experience, are 0. I must judge the past from the present knowledge I have. God may have done a plethora of miracles in the past, and he may do another plethora of miracles in the future, but in my world, miracles don't happen. God could do that. Craig Keener could actually document that, but they don't happen. And I have better critical facilities about that. I'm sorry, I wish they did happen in a way. They just don't, they just don't. If they did, then, let's have one. Let's have one. And the standard one is take somebody whose leg has been amputated and have it grow back in front of us. But God does things mysteriously. He does things different. He does things under a cloud of mystery, and only the believers can actually see that sort of stuff. And that'd be testing him too much. We don't want to do that. So I can't really reasonably do otherwise. So let me just read you from Bart Ehrman, since he's been bandied about a little bit today. It says, all historians can do is show what probably happened. That's the problem with miracles. Miracles, by our very definition of the term, are virtually impossible events. So, miracles, by their very nature, are always the least probable explanations for what happened. Suppose that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, and then a couple of Jesus' followers, not among the 12, decided that night to move the body somewhere more appropriate. And they encountered a couple of Roman legionnaires who catch these followers with this dead body, and in the process they end up killing them because they suspect foul play. And so now the soldiers they have 3 bodies in their hand. They don't know which one was being carried, and so they decide to just get rid of them. Take a cart and cart these 3 corpses off to the valley of the grave yard and dump them. And then within 3 or 4 minutes, the bodies have deteriorated beyond recognition. Jesus' original tomb is empty, and no one seems to know why. Now, is this scenario likely, Bart Ehrman says? No, it's not likely at all. Am I proposing that this is what happened? No, he says, absolutely not. I'm not proposing that this is what happened. Is it more probable that something like this may have happened than that a miracle happened and Jesus left the tomb to ascend into heaven? Absolutely, he says. From a purely historical point of view, a highly unlikely, improbable event is far more probable than a virtually impossible one. And with that, I end. Thank you so much.
So thanks to both our debaters. A final round of applause for both of them for their excellent debate tonight. We're going to enter a 15-minute audience question and answer session. We're probably only going to have time for, I would imagine, 4 questions totals, and we need to alternate between the 2. Whoever asks the question, of whomever the question is asked, they will have 2 minutes to respond. The other person will have 1 minute to comment, and then we'll go the question to the next person. The microphone's here, so if you want to start lining up there. And if there are many of you, maybe you can get together and decide what the best question would be to pose. While that's happening, I would like to not only thank our debaters, but thank Reston Bible Church. Also thank Nat Sears and Will Gaines for sponsoring this debate. Will Gaines and his class Faith and Reason meet here at Reston Bible. And if you are interested in these kinds of questions, we have a class here at 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings called Solid Ground. In it, we have Christians, atheists, agnostics, skeptics. Dennis, who I think, there's Dennis right here, is one of our favorite atheists in the class, if you're allowed to rank order them by order of priority. And I'm sure he would like some extra company as well. But we would encourage you to come. It's in the room upstairs 250 at 9 o'clock on Sundays, and would love to have you there and love to hear your perspective. Now we'll go to the question and answer time. The first question, for whom is your first question?
I think I'll go to David.
Okay. First question is for David. You'll have 2 minutes, and then John, you'll have 1 minute to comment on that one.
Just, this was something that I'm sorry I blurted it out earlier, but I still want to hear your answer. You were saying how you respect textual criticism and so forth, and that nothing that you've said would be affected by the textual criticism. However, in an earlier part, and I recognize you were speaking mainly about 1 Corinthians, not about Mark, but in the part where you did actually respond to something in Mark about there being no resurrection appearances in Mark, you quoted from the part which is disputed, which most scholars would say is not part of the original Gospel of Mark. And then the other thing is, you say that the 1 Corinthians 15 is dated from only a couple of years after the crucifixion, but it would be hard for Paul to have had his full Mediterranean ministry and then write the epistle with only a few years.
And can you ask us your question, please? So
I have two things. One, explain what the evidence is that that quote is early rather than something that's relatively recent at the time of Paul's writing. And two, explain why you choose to discard textual criticism for the ending of Mark, but still hold on to it for other things.
Thank you.
As far as Mark, I didn't. No, I didn't. Textual critics in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 8, I quoted, I think, verse 6. So I didn't quote anything from after verse.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed.
From after verse 8. No, that's fine. That's fine. This happens. As far as 1 Corinthians 15, it's actually a much longer discussion, but Paul uses the language of giving and receiving oral tradition. Paul, as a Pharisee, is obsessed with tradition, right? That's what the Pharisees were famous. You had the tradition of the rabbis, and you pass it down. And whoever is most zealous for affirming and quoting these traditions is sort of the awesomest Pharisee, and that's why Paul in Galatians says that he was advancing beyond many of his countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. But when Paul becomes a Christian, he doesn't change his love of tradition. He just he changes the source, right? It's no longer being passed down by the rabbis; it goes to the apostles, and that's why even in Galatians, which John says rules out the Apostle Paul getting anything from anyone else, what does he do with his gospel? He says he goes to the apostles in Jerusalem, talks to them in private to make sure that after 17 years of preaching, he hasn't been running in vain. So Paul, after 17 years of preaching, is willing to go in there and say, am I right about this? Because if you guys say I'm wrong, I'm in trouble. So that's Paul's respect for tradition. And in 1 Corinthians 15, he uses the language of giving and receiving and giving, oral tradition. So what I received, I passed on to you. And then, and by the way, any teacher who's ever graded papers, and you can spot, when someone is plagiarizing Wikipedia. I have this students, and all of a sudden, hey, this doesn't sound like you writing anymore. Anyone who's experienced that, and then I just Google the part that sounds different, I found out it comes from Wikipedia, and then someone gets called to the office. But this is not Pauline. The language is not Paul's. Paul does not speak this way.
Thank you, David.
Oh, sorry.
John.
Talk afterwards, go more detail.
The thought just occurred to me. I like having new thoughts. I throw them out. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. And here's a thought. Not that the disciples stole the body or that he swooned on the cross. You deal with that effectively, I think. But what if Paul lied? Now, you would object to that outright, wouldn't you? Because you regard him as an inspired author. But what if he just lied? It never occurred to me just till now. Maybe I'm sure I'm off the wall. We don't know Paul. We're reading documents, ancient documents, and Paul says, you know what? I came and checked my story out with the early disciples or what have you. First of all, he says, I never received this from man. And then he preached it for 17 years. And he says, hey, and I went to Jerusalem, and they confirmed I was preaching the right stuff. Really?
Thank you, John. We appreciate it. Thank you.
It's more believable than a resurrection.
Question for John.
All right. Yeah, and I'd like to thank both of you for speaking with us tonight. I was a history major in college and a philosophy minor, so your perspectives were very interesting. My question for you, John, is, when you were a Christian, specifically a seminarian and a pastor, why were you convinced that the gospel was true during that period in your life?
Why was I convinced that the gospel was
true?
Why was I convinced that the gospel was true? Because I read C.S. Lewis. I read Josh McDowell. I read Francis Schaeffer. And the Bible, because the Bible wasn't good enough. You had to read more than that, I was convinced because of a really dramatic experience. Experiences like a Damascus Road type of thing. And I was raised to be a believer, and then I fell away, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, ask him about his falling away. Whew, he's got the story to tell you, I'll tell you that. But he had a dramatic story just like I do. I mean, his was more dramatic if you want to compare stories. I didn't know any better. I just didn't know any better. People will grasp on the stories and believe them because they offer hope over truth any day. I did. Then I studied my faith out, and I eventually came to reject it. It was wrong. It may have saved me from jail back in those days, but I grasped onto it because of the hope it offered rather than the truth and the evidence that was there.
All right. But John mentioned my story. You're going to type in David Wood, why I'm a Christian, into YouTube.
You'll get smacked in the head with some solid truth.
Yeah, because people kept asking me about it, so I put it up there. In fact, John was one of the ones who asked me about it. What was your life like as an atheist? All right, I'll tell you. But John says he believed, and then he didn't believe, and he came to doubt. But notice the shift that has occurred. At some point, he adopts the methodology, the odds of a resurrection in my world are zero. That's what he said. And if the odds are zero, then yeah, no amount of testimony could ever show you that any miracle has occurred. And notice, if God appeared right now and started striking lightning bolts around, the odds of that are zero ahead of time. So there's just no evidence that will ever convince us.
Thank you. Question for David.
Hi, I'm Dennis. I'm Scott's favorite atheist.
We know who you are.
I, like John, am an ex-Christian who is now an atheist, although I'm told by many Christians that I couldn't possibly have been a Christian if I'm now an atheist. And my answer to these people is everyone in this room is an atheist. John and I just go one God further. But this question really is for both. Neither one of you won this debate. Neither one of you. You didn't change a single mind.
Friend
I've been
Dennis,
doing this for 10 years.
If we do need a question.
Okay. Maybe there's a compromise between you two. This is a question for both of you. Isn't it possible that maybe there wasn't a physical bodily resurrection, but maybe there was not a vision, but a spiritual resurrection? That people believe that the spirit of Jesus was raised and ascended into heaven. Did it have to go through a body? That's my question.
You said it's both of us, so you want to go first for a second?
Since you've been taking them first for a while, I'll take this one first. Okay. There are Christian scholars that say that it wasn't a bodily resurrection, it was a vision. And other Christian scholars say, well, it wasn't a bodily resurrection, it wasn't a vision, it was an event. Some kind of, they call it the Easter event, leaving it unspecified, Well, listen, what happens if people change their minds about something? people will choose to believe based on hope. That's all there is to it. And something may have triggered that. All it takes usually is one person, an influential person, who says, you know what? I feel Jesus right now. Yeah, you know, I do too. And the candles are lit, and it's dark, and there's some music, and the bongo drums. Yeah, I think I hear him talking to me. No, what's he saying? He's saying, I love you, which he would never say he hates you, of course. And what else is he saying? He says he's still alive. I think I hear that too. And so the hope has arisen, and it could have happened that way. You know, it could have happened that way. But why should I accept that? Why should I go with that? I mean, if that's all the evidence, screw it.
I didn't say this during the debate, but as far as the overall position that John adopts, that these were visionary appearances and that this gave the disciples their belief, I believe that this is the strongest alternative to the resurrection. That doesn't mean I think it's good at all. I think it's better than all the competitors. And the reason is it doesn't force you to deny known, undisputable facts of history. So, for instance, Islam denies Jesus' death. Jesus doesn't die. Well, if we know anything about Jesus, we know that he died. Other theories might deny that there were appearances. So if you say that it developed through legend or something like that, there were no appearances of the apostles. This just was some story that someone invented later on. So as far as the vision hypothesis, you can acknowledge that Jesus died, and you can acknowledge that the disciples were completely convinced that Jesus had appeared to them. So you can acknowledge those main facts, but then you can just say, well, it happened by vision. Now the problem is there's another fact involved. And that is that the disciples were not preaching that they had seen vision. Again, they loved vision. Paul goes on receiving visions. But in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, and last of all, he appeared to me also. So this is the final one, right? This is the final one. Well, if it's just visions, Paul continued having visions. Other Christians continued having visions. There are Christians who have visions today. So if Paul is saying there is this limited class of appearances that only happen with certain people, what are they? Well, he tells us. He tells us in passages like Romans 8:11 and Philippians 3:20-21, where he talks about raising Jesus bodily. We will be raised bodily the way Jesus was raised bodily. So if the apostles are claiming resurrection, we hear resurrection and we think it means the same thing as, just some sort of otherworldly existence or something. Resurrection is physical and bodily. It is the raising of the physical body to a supernatural state. Since this is what they're claiming, something big happened to convince them that was Jesus appearing to them physically.
Thank you. Your question is for?
Mr. Loftus.
And is your question for David? Then these will be our two last questions. Good.
Okay. So, Mr. Loftus, my question is, you say that the best that we have in terms of accounts of the resurrection are second, third, fourth-hand accounts at best, and you say, where are the eyewitnesses? Where's the corroborative evidence? But then you say eyewitness testimony is so unreliable. So why spend so much time harping on the lack of eyewitness testimony if you're just going to say it's unreliable if you get it?
Well, I said that you need an overwhelming amount of non-controversial evidence to overcome the concrete experience that we have that people don't get up from the dead, okay? Eyewitness testimony is valuable, but we need a lot of it. If I said I levitated this morning, while I was preparing for this debate, you wouldn't believe me. If I said David saw me levitate, maybe a little more credibility. If you said you saw me levitate, what? Are they all crazy or what? What if it was on video, camera? Well, all of a sudden, you need that kind of evidence. Because eyewitness testimony is really unreliable. It really is. There have been studies shown in court cases, someone points out, he did, yes, he's the murderer. And it's shown up later that they were wrong. They just had this idea of a particular kind of person that might have done this kind of deed, and they pointed out that kind of guy, and without the DNA evidence that lets them off the hook 20 years later, because now we've got that, they were wrong in seeing that. So eyewitness testimony is unreliable, but you need a lot of it when it comes to an extraordinary event like someone rising from the dead. Does that satisfy your question?
Almost. So then my small follow-up question to that is, so is 200 million not quite there yet?
Like in China? He mentioned 200 million people who said
Yeah.
that? Well, I read to you a little paragraph about the world of the Bible. Handkerchiefs handkerchiefs healing people and shadows and pools that are stirred. There are cultures like that. They don't have doctors. I mean, I'm not trying to belittle any culture that I'm not aware of, but in the ancient culture especially, they didn't have the modern medicine, and they went to shamans, and they offered prayers and anklets and I don't know what else to try to heal people. And if they got healed, then they credited their god with doing the healing. And I suspect China is like that.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, John says we need an overwhelming amount of evidence, but I think you're exactly right. There is no amount of evidence that could, because what happened, the probability of a resurrection or a miracle is zero in John's world. So no amount of evidence can. If you start with a probability, this is Bayesianism right here. But if you're starting with a prior probability of zero, no amount of evidence can ever change that. He says, eyewitness testimony is valuable, but we need a lot of it. And you're exactly right. Hundreds of millions of cases is not enough. If we're dealing with the apostles, I mean, think about that. Eyewitness testimony, he pointed out, court appearances. Yes, eyewitnesses can get a lot wrong in little details. But in things like, hey, there are over 500 of us, we're all seeing this guy alive after his death. That's not some little detail where, you saw a blue car and I saw a green car, right? Like in a court appearance. So if we're talking about the evidence here, this is a lot of evidence, and you have to raise your bar of skepticism almost to the roof if you want to deny this sort of thing.
Hi, this question's for David. Just to give you a background, I'm a little bit more on John's side. I'm a member of the Clergy Project, and I feel that I have to give you some points, and no offense to John, I think that your communication skills and your rhetoric were very strong.
Who's better looking?
And definitely you're better looking, but he does have a better hat. A couple things that really stuck out with me in listening to you was your...
Could you phrase your...
yes, your repetition...
yours in the form of a question, please.
Your repetition of the... idea that you're stating multiple facts, but you're talking about one passage in 1 Corinthians from a Christian source over and over again, and you're saying that these people, the disciples were the martyrs, the true believers who went out and died for their faith. What about true believers of other faiths, of other beliefs? There are lots of martyrs in the world today. And how do you compare that and look at that and say that yours is better?
Thank you.
Well, I'd have to see some specific cases. If I look around the world and I see there are Christians who are being martyred, and it's happening pretty regularly, thanks to our ISIS. But I don't look at a Christian martyr and say, you see, there's evidence for Christianity. Just like I don't see, an ISIS suicide bomber and say, oh, there's evidence for Islam. The point of the martyrdom is it shows the sincerity of belief, right? When a Christian dies today for Christianity, all I can say is this person really believes in Christianity. When a Muslim dies for Islam, all I can say is that person really believes in Islam. So I brought up the martyrdom, the torture, the imprisonments, and so on of the apostles just to respond to the idea that these guys are making it up, or that they have some sort of loose, foggy belief that some shady appearance has appeared to them or something like this. They had an amazing degree of confidence to go to that level. And the difference is the disciples aren't getting this from some message, right? If I go out and die for what I believe, it's because I heard something, right? I heard a message, I believed it, I believe there's evidence for it, I go out and die for it. The disciples were enduring persecution for something they saw. So that leads me to the question, what did these people see? What did they see with their eyes? I can't say they're lying, right? If they're dying for it, they believe their message. But their message is, we saw this guy alive from the dead. That was the core, the heart of their message. So I have to believe these guys saw something. And guess what? scholars across the board agree with me. So we're all acknowledging these guys saw something. What did they see? Well, hallucinations, vision, that sort of thing can't account for it. So what did they see? And if you're ruling out miraculous explanations or something, yeah, you're going to have to say, well, whatever it wasn't a resurrection, so they must have seen something else. But if you're not opposed to that, then you've got a miracle on your hands, and that's what would explain it. As far as the 1 Corinthians passage, I quoted that just because it's the earliest and the best, and that's what scholars, Christian atheist scholars, everyone points out. So I pointed that because it's the earliest. We have bunches of other sources, both in the Bible and outside the Bible, and so there are plenty, but that's the earliest and best, so that's what I went with.
Is this the last time?
The last 60 seconds.
I get the last 6 seconds. Well, I just want to thank the church and the organizers for this wonderful time, and it's an honor to be here. And you're a remarkable church to invite me in to debate a central tenet of your faith. You certainly are committed to educating your people and in the search for the truth. And I hope I was a helpful participant in that. I think I've said everything I want to say anyway. So.
Thanks, John. And one final round of applause for our debaters for the job they did tonight. If this was interesting to you, we will see you Sunday at 9 o'clock to continue discussing these kinds of things. Thank you for coming tonight, and we appreciate you being here.